So I'm taking carriage of introducing Michael. And this is the gang minus Rachel and minus Joan. But maybe when you ask questions, you can give Michael a bit of an introduction rather than me going around and introducing everybody. But I will do the process of introducing Michael. So Michael and I have known each other for quite some time, haven't we? I don't know how many years, but
I would not like to venture.
no. So Michael is actually in the Faculty of Law at the University of Oxford, but I think that's a guise, really, isn't it? So Michael is part of Jane Kay's team at the Centre for Health Law and Emerging Technologies, HELEX. And so that was sort of more of an independent entity, but now it's become part of the faculty for a whole array of reasons. And I'm sure it's all good, isn't it?
Yes, I think we'll not go into that particular. I think
No, no.
otherwise that's a whole other seminar that we don't really have time.
Exactly. Yeah. But of course, this Helix and this Helix South, which is at Melbourne University. And so Tess is still part of Helix South, at least for the next little while, because Jane and Mark Taylor supervised her PhD there. Um, so Michael is a sociologist by training. I think I can say that, kind of very much in the science and society space. And his interests and mine have aligned for many years, particularly relating to innovative health technologies, or as Michael calls them, biomodifying technologies. So we had two big projects over the past few years, one called Biomod and one called BioGov. And I'm assuming you might mention a little bit about those, Michael, but which really looked at the issues associated with the 3D bioprinting, gene editing, and iPS cells. So it's right in our sort of areas of interest. His latest projects, I just saw online, have the interesting acronyms of acronyms acronyms of realm and heal. And I don't know if you want to tell us about those, Michael, but his focus today is on alternative pathways for stem cell therapies. So I'll leave it to you, Michael, and you can introduce those projects to us at the start if you like.
Thanks, Di. Thank you very much. So I do have some slides that I'm going to share, but I will just very briefly uh, speak to those two projects
Mhm.
before I get started. I'm actually not really talking about things that are directly relevant to those, so I should point out those acronyms are not my coinage. They are large European projects that I am just a small cog in. So with these big EU projects, they regularly have over 100 people on each project spread out across multiple institutions and usually 8, 9, 10, 12 countries depending on just how much money has been allocated. uh, so that's something that I do. It's sort of part of my strategy. Sometimes I will lead my own slightly smaller projects, and sometimes I will be part of these much bigger projects because within the European union system, it's mandatory now for all STEM-led projects to have some sort of social sciences, humanities, ethics element within them. And where those projects are about stem cells, innovation, those types of things, that can be quite a useful little niche to occupy. Realms, I'm actually not going to talk about at all today. It's a bit of a departure because it's actually about AI and healthcare. So that is something slightly new for me. I'm very, very glad that I'm part of a much bigger team on that because I would really be out of my depth if I was doing that on my own. So I'm going to be a more familiar territory today, talking about stem cells. So I think with that, I will start to share my slides, and we'll have the usual thing where I need to check that the screen share has worked and that you can see the slides properly. So bear with me for just 1 second. So can I get it to go into slide mode? Okay, can everyone
Looks good,
see them?
Michael. Yep.
Brilliant. Okay,
Mhm.
thank you. So, as Di's already very kindly mentioned, the title of my talk today is The Limits of Regulatory Pharmaceuticalisation. And don't worry, I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a second. And I'm going to touch on the original title I gave was Global Development Supporting Clinical Innovation with Advanced Therapies. That turned out to be a little bit ambitious. I'm going to look at a couple of examples of these developments. I'm certainly not going to attempt to cover all of them. Otherwise, you will never ever get to bed this evening. So, just to give you a little run through of what I'm going to talk about, I want to do a very short detour into just discussing some terminology so that we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to introduce this idea of regulatory pharmaceuticalisation, which is not my idea. It's something that Alex Faulkner, who worked with me on BioMod and BioGov, coined. But I think it's a very interesting concept. And I'm going to look at some of the consequences of this regulatory pharmaceuticalisation, mainly looking at the EU level jurisdiction, and that would also largely apply to the UK because we still follow a lot of the European Union's legislation on stem cells, on human tissue, on blood, and a lot of these areas because it was transcribed into national law. And it has not yet been repealed, and there may be good reasons for it not to be repealed. Then I'm going to look at some of the alternatives to, I guess, what we might call the standard stem cell product development pathway, and that is examples of clinical innovation. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is and what it isn't. But the two examples I've chosen are the hospital exemption within the European Union and the Act on the Safety of Regenerative Medicine in Japan. Then I'm going to finish, instead of concluding, I'm going to finish with a proposal, which is sort of an idea that I've been playing with and I want to put out there for discussion. It is a little bit controversial, so I think this would be a very interesting group to discuss it with. It does broadly overall relate to openness and stem cell research, but possibly in a slightly different way to openness at the upstream stage of academic research. So, terminology, just very briefly to clarify, I tend to use the term advanced therapies. What I mean by that is basically medicines, therapeutic interventions based on human cells, tissues, and or genetic modification. Obviously, for the purposes of your project, the therapies using cells and especially stem cells are going to be most relevant. But these things are known by a variety of different regulatory classifications in different jurisdictions. For Australia, they're mostly what the TGA would consider class 3 and class 4 biologicals, if I've understood the scheme correctly. But again, yes, they're different names in different places, but just so that we're all on the same page, I'll be using the term advanced therapies mostly. So, okay, onto the main theme of the talk, the idea of regulatory pharmaceuticalisation. As I mentioned, this is a term that was developed by Alex Faulkner. Alex was a professor of, I think, sort of global governance and innovation policy at Sussex University. He is now retired, or at least semi-retired. But it started from the recognition that regulatory regime building is a politically negotiated part of the innovation process of new technologies. So what Alex was really trying to say here is that when we have a new technology, the way that it's regulated, how we understand it, how we classify it, how we identify possible risks and benefits and pathways for its development is itself something that's politically negotiated. And this came out of looking at the debates within the European Union over whether tissue engineered medicines should be medicinal products or medical devices or something else. So in the early stages of the emergence of advanced therapies, there were a number of different competing visions about what they were and how they should be delivered. And two of these in particular are quite distinct. So on the one hand, you have the idea of medical procedures. So these are things that are produced usually for individual patients on a small scale, quite often in a particular hospital, usually using the patient's own cells to treat the patients, and treated in many respects like a novel surgical procedure, or a novel one-time intervention. And on the other hand, you have this idea of advanced therapies as medicinal products. So things that are and should be mass produced, standardized as far as possible, preferably allogeneic, so using a single donor to multiple patients. Also with as much centralized manufacturing as is achievable. So one manufacturing site supplying multiple hospitals, maybe large regions or even countries internationally. And they should be regulated as a medicinal product. So through national regulatory agencies, going through product approval processes. And these two visions were in competition for a while, and to some extent still are. I want to look at what happened within the European Union. And what this is sort of what Alex was terming as an example of regulatory pharmaceuticalisation. So the pharmaceuticalisation bit is the choice or the political outcome that the most appropriate pathway for advanced therapies is to base that pathway on the existing pathway for small molecule pharmaceutical drugs and biological drugs. And within the EU, the distinction was made between things that are still considered medical procedures, so blood transfusions, and some cell and tissue transplants, including, for example, bone marrow transplants and organ transplants, which are typically non-marketable. They are typically offered as a service provided by hospitals, and certainly within public healthcare systems, they're offered on a not-for-profit basis. And so to separate out an area of marketable, commercializable products that could also be made from living cells and tissues, the EU uses a 3-point distinction, roughly. So these are substantial manipulation of the cells, non-homologous use, meaning that the cells should be used in if the cells are being applied to a part of the body where they don't naturally occur, where they are not commonly found. So, for example, if you were using bone marrow stem cells to treat heart muscle repair, that would be a non-homologous use. And industrial production, which is not very well defined in the ATMP legislation, but has been interpreted by a couple of court cases, basically as meaning any large scale or multiple batch production. So, what are some of the consequences of this use of the pharmaceutical pathway as sort of the best or the most appropriate way to guide advanced therapies to the market? I think first and foremost, then it solidifies and gives a legal basis for this idea that advanced therapies are medicinal products. It then requires a system of clinical trial-based evidence submitted for marketing authorization review before those products can enter the market and be applied to patients and be available for healthcare systems to use. It also puts an emphasis in scale-up, standardization, industrial manufacture as far as is technically feasible. And this does largely mean, partly because of the costs, that development is largely expected to be through the private sector. So this is creating a market for advanced therapies, which is one of the aims of the European Union. It is to create a harmonized single market within Europe. But this is also bolstered by quite a lot of policy focus at the national level in terms of growing country level advanced therapy industries based on startups, university spin-out companies, support from medium-sized enterprises, and a little bit of interest from big pharma that's been patchy. So that's all well and good, but why might we not want to be entirely dependent on the private sector for our cell therapy? So this is the bit of the talk where I'm going to get a little bit controversial. is this the best possible outcome? Is this the way we should be doing things? Should we be locking this in with the legal framework? So one reason why we might not want to depend entirely on the private sector for our advanced therapy products is the cost. So these are some example costs. I've used UK list prices because they're publicly available. They will obviously be different in Australia, as they are in the US, as they are in France and Germany. There's no standardized pricing for these things. And even when I'm using the official list prices, very often these products are subject to specific negotiations between the manufacturer and the NHS. And a lot of the time, those negotiations are confidential. So there will be a discount or an altered price. Very occasionally, it will be higher than the list price. But basically, those are typically not disclosed to the public. So unfortunately, I can't provide you the real prices. But going by the list prices, we can see that they range from the relatively cheap Spherox cartilage repair, which is £10,000 for treatment, right up to the very most expensive gene therapies, Zolgensma, which is almost £2 million per treatment. The main point really that I want to take away from this is, for the most part, these are expensive therapies. These are very expensive therapies. And that can be a problem for publicly funded healthcare systems. That can really be a challenge, especially as more cell and gene therapies and obviously combined cell and gene therapies. So we have Yescarta and Kymriah there, which were both CAR T therapies on the list, and both pretty expensive. Another reason why we might not want to be entirely dependent on the private sector for cell therapies is that that does mean that the therapies we get are largely dependent on commercial research priorities. And there are two trends here that I think are worth looking at. The first one is something that Jonathan Gabe and Paul Martin have called orphanization. So this partly relates to personalized medicine. It's the use of genomics, biomarkers, companion diagnostics, other tools of personalization to fragment common disease categories such as heart disease, diabetes, things like that, into subtypes defined by a particular genomic marker or a particular set of biomarkers, such that those subtypes then count as orphan diseases. They're relatively narrow designations. And also seeing that coupled with regulatory changes such as accelerated access programs, conditional reimbursement, orphan drug medicine pricing, extended patent protection, which incentivizes these so-called niche buster developments in drug development. And you see that outside of advanced therapies, but you also definitely see that quite strongly happening in the advanced therapy market. And the second trend is what Swaminathan et al. Have called just basically a lack of systematic approaches to setting R&D priorities. And this is also something that people like Mariana Mazzucato have talked about. And essentially, with no top-down steering, the priorities of what gets invested in, what companies take forward, is basically left to the market. So it's left to calculations of which disease areas will turn the greatest return on investment at the lowest risk. And we see this, for example, in the fact that there are huge numbers of drug development candidates for different types of oncology, and then you have large areas of neglected disease, which was very little investment for, and also other things, even diseases that affect high income countries, such as a number of neurodegenerative diseases. The pharmaceutical industry has been historically notoriously bad at coming up with effective new drugs in those areas. So some of the likely results, and I am speculating here, but I think it's not too far-fetched, the likely results of the combination of those trends of orphanization and some sort of market-driven research priorities is that we will get some very expensive advanced therapies for a narrow range of niche conditions, and quite a few of those will probably be oncology. At the same time, we will have a lack of advanced therapies, even in some cases where they would be clinically viable, but the patients are in disease subgroups that are basically not sexy, not attractive for industry to look at. They may have lower reimbursement rates because the patient population is very small, because the patient population is not considered to be in areas with really strong reimbursement, or the existing standard of care is not great but very cheap. So very high cost advanced therapies are always going to suffer on cost benefit comparisons. So there's a number of reasons why we might expect gaps where it's not a scientific reason why we couldn't get an advanced therapy, it's a commercial reason. And also, just to give you some evidence to support that, this is a list of advanced therapies that have been approved in Europe. So they got through marketing authorization approval. That means they were judged by the European Medicines Agency to be safe and to be sufficiently efficacious to be worth granting a marketing authorization, but have since been withdrawn, largely for commercial reasons. I'm including Holoclar in that because although it hasn't been withdrawn from the market, Holostem, who produce Holoclar, went bankrupt and had to be rescued by investment from the Italian state in 2023. So I would consider that a market failure rescued by state intervention. So, what is the alternative? Well, this is going back obviously to the second vision or understanding of what advanced therapies could be that I introduced at the start of this talk, and this is the clinical innovation pathway. So by clinical innovation, I mean clinician-led development and application of novel treatments and procedures, in this case including advanced therapies. It isn't necessarily, but it can often be supported by academic or public laboratory funded research and development. It may be entirely publicly funded, but in some cases, including Japan, which I'm going to talk about, it can also be done by private or for-profit clinics. And it typically doesn't require marketing authorization and approval. Now, before we go any further, I really want to address the elephant in the room. Are we talking about so-called unproven or unapproved cell therapies? Well, yes, we are. But I would advise everyone not to panic. So obviously there's been a lot of concern about unproven cell therapies across the world and stem cell tourism, and they have been associated with this idea of rogue or black market clinics and exploitative fraudulent treatments. And there is a perception that they only occur because of regulatory failure. Now, while I absolutely would not want to endorse some of the genuinely fraudulent and criminal treatments that have been offered to unfortunate patients, I do think we can pay too much weight to sort of legalistic bioethics and ignore that space, what I would consider a legitimate space of experimental therapies between standard care and clinical trials and experimental research. So there is a space between routine care and research for experimental therapies, but to be done properly, it requires a distinct, its own regulatory pathway, and it can, and I think should, involve different standards of evidence. It's not care, it's not research, it is something else. So just to give some examples of clinical innovation that have historically delivered viable treatments that are still in use, the classic example is obviously bone marrow transplantation. It was never commercialized, wasn't really developed by commercial companies, it was developed by clinicians. Similarly with all the different kinds of organ transplants over the years. A less well-known example is the development of clinical cytogenetic testing in the UK, also largely developed within the NHS with some academic collaborators. And we also see something similar for various rare immune disease diagnostics that have also been developed within public healthcare systems, again with academic support. So this can be done. It's not this completely out there idea. And so I also then want to look at some of the existing pathways for clinical innovation with cell therapies that have sprung up, and these are my two case studies. So the first case study I want to look at is the use of the hospital exemption, and specifically in Spain, because Spain is one of the European countries that makes I think the most, I guess, robust use of the hospital exemption. So it's a little bit difficult to find this information, but there are at least 4 publicly approved or publicly developed cell therapies in Spain that are being developed by public hospitals, and which are reimbursed by the regional authorities. So healthcare in Spain is funded through a number of regional authorities. Their budgeting is partly set by the national government, but it goes to regional authorities. I could only find clear information about 2 of them because a lot of the information is in Spanish and my Spanish is not very good. So Google Translate has had to help me with this. But there's certainly these 2 therapies: an autologous adult mesenchymal stem cell treatment for spinal cord injury repair, which is available in Madrid, and a sort of homebrew CAR T therapy, which is available in Barcelona. As I said, there are 2 other cell therapies. So these have both been publicly funded, entirely publicly funded and developed, and are available to patients. And the reason I mentioned Spain is that the Spanish regulators allow the hospital exemption to be used for multiple treatments, whereas some European regulators, notably the MHRA in the UK, really restricts the hospital exemption to 1 or 2 uses at most per treatment. And this is not, there are other similar examples around the world. So for example, the Sheba Medical Center in Israel has also developed its own CAR T therapy, which it routinely delivers, and that was largely publicly funded using commercial machinery, but it's delivered through the public hospital. And similarly, there's the BioCanRx consortium in Canada, which is largely public hospitals in Ottawa and Vancouver, have also developed their own CAR T, which they're also delivering to patients, again, largely through public funding. Now, they have actually gone through clinical trials because there is no hospital exemption provision or no equivalent provision in Canada. So they've actually had to take this through clinical trials. So just to mention a couple of characteristics of this pathway, it supports clinical innovation, usually at specific individual medical centers, mostly public hospitals. Typically, it's reimbursed either by national governments or by regional health authorities. Single site provision, so the patients travel to the site. And what we see in Spain, for example, is that patients from other regions can go to those hospitals in Barcelona or Madrid if their regional health authority will then pay the cost. And these do typically yield lower costs than commercial products. So, for example, the NC1 therapy in Spain is about 20,000 euros, which is compared to sort of 280,000 for a lot of the other cell therapies at their list price. Some of the problems is obviously that the HE pathway is restricted to one-off use in the UK and some other UK countries. How strict the regulator wants to interpret that provision is down to national regulatory authorities. It's not set at the EU level. There's significant industry lobby against the existence of this pathway. So PHMRA and other industry lobby bodies and a number of times have tried to get this pathway closed down entirely. IP issues may inhibit the development, and this is something, so far it's been difficult to find the information on what's happening in Spain, but there are concerns about what's going to happen when companies hold a lot of the crucial IP for some of these therapies in other areas. And obviously the hospital exemption applies within the European Union. There are other jurisdictions where there's no equivalent, and as far as I understand, Australia is one of those jurisdictions where there's not a pathway for unapproved therapies to be legitimately used in that way. I could be wrong, so please correct me later if I'm wrong about that. So I want to move on to my second case study that I'm going to go through fairly quickly. This is the Act on the Safety of Regenerative Medicine in Japan. So in 2014, the Japanese Parliament approved 2 new laws. One of these was the Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Act, and this was a revision of the existing pharmaceutical affairs law, essentially to create a specific market pathway for regenerative medicine, and it introduced and formalized the regulatory category of regenerative medicine, which in Japan covers cell therapies and gene therapies. And this is largely your standard pharmaceutical-based clinical trial pathway to market access. It does have a conditional approval mechanism that I'm not going to talk about today. Other people have written about that elsewhere. The one I'm interested in is the second act that was passed at the same time, the Act on the Safety of Regenerative Medicine. So this creates a novel risk-based oversight system for both clinical research, so clinical trials conducted in hospitals in the public sector, but also for innovative therapy. So in other words, the type of clinical innovation that I've been talking about. Interestingly, the Act actually makes a distinction. So the PMD Act is for commercial developers. The Act on the Safety of Regenerative Medicine is only accessible by academics, public sector hospitals, or private clinics, who in Japan are considered distinct from commercial companies. And so the ASRM route does not have any option or any requirement for marketing authorization and approval. Oops, no, that's sorry. Okay, that slide has gone wrong. But anyway, again, it supports clinical innovation. It uses 3 tiers of risks, so sort of homologous, non-manipulated cells are the lowest tier of risks, so they only require local oversight. One of the interesting things about this pathway is that it does actually allow clinical innovation with substantially manipulated cell therapies, even pluripotent stem cell therapies, but that does require a higher level of risk assessment, so it has to be assessed locally and by a national review committee. It also mandates that all the studies go into a national centralized database of studies, including not only what the therapy was, who was going to be treated, but also the mechanism of action, and it's supposed to record the outcomes. The law has also been used to take action against non-compliant clinics, so clinics that would be more considered providing rogue or unapproved cell therapies. Okay, that slide did not work. So some problems with the ASRM at the minute is that the actual follow-up, the actual oversight is a bit limited. There's some evidence that not everything goes into the database, not everything goes in good time. There have been some serious questions about the quality of the review and oversight, and conflicts of interest arising in that process, and also that a lot of the oversight focuses on the cell type, whether it's pluripotent stem cells, adult stem cells, sort of ordinary tissues like a cartilage repair, and it neglects whether the procedure also includes novel or untried surgical elements, including new instruments, surgical application of surgical techniques to body parts where they're not commonly tried, and sometimes actually making that distinction between what's research and what's innovative care and how they should be overseen has not always been done very well within the Japanese system to date. So I'm going to come to my proposal then. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that there can, and I would say should, to make a normative claim, be a legitimate space for public sector clinical innovation with advanced therapies. This doesn't actually mean that commercialization is excluded, but it refocuses where commercial activity takes place. So for example, on manufacturing services, whether that's providing commercial manufacturing to hospitals, which is something you see in Japan, or providing the equipment, sort of automation, robots, reagents, all the things that you need to make a cell therapy that then can be used in a clinical setting. So those are both, it can even be in some cases commercial quality assurance and oversight on a for-profit basis. So it's not an anti-commercial pathway, but it's a pathway where the commercialization is focused in a different way to allow public sector innovation. The existing pathways that I've mentioned, they do exist. They're imperfect and they're not always accessible, but there is room for what Alex Faulkner has called governation or innovative governance. So there is room to think about what we do going forward. And I think, my view, is that this should start from the recognition that cell therapies are not necessarily inherently products. We can have, as we've seen in Japan, a product-based pathway for commercial developers, but we can also have alternative pathways that recognize the procedure-like nature of localized clinical innovation. As we see to some extent with the hospital exemption, although it still treats it still treats the products that are being delivered as products that are not yet approved. Whereas with the ASRM, it recognizes that these are not products. I want to be very clear that the system is not immune to bad actors, and there's quite a few examples that we could mention. So it does need a robust regulatory framework. It's not enough just to say, well, we can trust doctors; they can do a bit of clinical innovation without oversight. And we've seen from Japan an attempt at marking that out. There's some limitations in that system, but I think that's also a good learning experience. And I think it does require an acceptance that we use different standards of evidence for safety and efficacy, so not being wedded to this idea of the single gold standard of evidence of 3-phase randomized placebo-controlled trials. But I think an important thing to remember is that the rise of expedited access pathways, which we see not just in Japan, but in America and in Europe, conditional approval, and the fact that for most advanced therapies, most cell therapies, we already see single arm, phase 1-2 combined, non-controlled trials with very small sample sizes. So we are already not at that imagined gold standard of large scale randomized placebo-controlled trials for these therapies. That doesn't happen, and it may never happen. So I think going forward, there's some important work for regulatory scholars to think about how these pathways could operate, what safeguards we need to put in place, and how we can learn from the different examples around the world. So I'm going to finish there, and hopefully that has given us some things to discuss. And yeah, my references are all there if anyone wants the slides later.
Fantastic. And it would be great to get those slides, Michael. I've been frantically taking notes, but
yeah,
it would be
not a problem. Yeah, it's quite heavily referenced, so I'm
yeah, but the notes really helped me to get my head around these things. So that was really fantastic. I know that Christine has already put up at least one question, and I'm sure you'll have many others, Chris. Do you want to start the ball rolling?
Hi, Michael. Christine Wells here. I'm a stem cell researcher who works at the University of Melbourne, and I really want to thank you both for your clear talk, and also I think the proposal you're putting forward is really sensible.
Thank you. That's yeah.
My question comes down to not the current trend of modifying a person's own cells for an anti-cancer therapy in CAR T, or modifying cells for gene therapy, but for the next wave of cells, which are pluripotent stem cells, where the cell line has been made from an undisclosed donor in a commercial setting. And around the world, almost Japan may be the exception, but I'm not sure. These cells are tied up with commercial companies, so that for you to get into a clinical trial, you have to partner very early. And the examples which are moving through to regulatory approval for clinical trial include for heart in the US, for Parkinson's disease and neural transplants, eye in Japan, and so on. So my question is, should we be allowed to commercialize a human cell in this way? Why does this not fall under any other body organ that cannot be commercialized and sold worldwide?
Thank you, Christine. That's a good question. I guess to some extent the horse has already bolted on that front. I think if we go back even in the US to something like the John Moore case, where the judge explicitly ruled that Moore was wronged but didn't have any ownership over his cells, and I think in the judge's verdict he actually said, or the justices variously, at least some of them said in their verdict, this is because giving patients control over their own tissues would inhibit our commercial development of biotechnology. Like it was explicitly, this is because we want to build an industry on this, and that whole model of using consent to separate people from their tissues and then allowing the tissues to become property through, I guess it's sort of a Lockean idea of, labor going into creating the cell line from, through through the scientist's labor of whether it's inducing pluripotency or culturing the cell line or deriving it from an embryo, or whatever the action is, has been around really since the 1980s. So it's very difficult to reverse. I think also part of the problem is that many governments want to create national industries in this area, so they're incentivized to pro-commercialization, pro-intellectual property legislative developments. So I think it's I think I have seen legal arguments against commodification and commercialization. I think the problem is getting them to the table. I would say two things. I would say, obviously, you're right about Japan to a certain extent. So some of the eye therapy. So I think Masao Takashima, Professor Takashima's eye therapy, at least some of that treatment took place under the ASRM rather than being a full-blown clinical trial. And they did get support from the state to help develop some of the IPS lines which they use. There are commercial IPS lines in Japan, as there are elsewhere.
She's only just had to settle though with, I think, Fujifilm around the licensing for the reprogramming factors, even though that was an academic invention in Japan. The license is owned by a company, and that's been a pretty protracted battle for her.
I mean, it's still, yes, it's obviously the first thing that University of Kyoto did was spin out Yamanaka's development into IPS Academia Japan to basically to do commercial licensing and to make money off the basic reprogramming. So yeah, that is absolutely an issue. And I mean, and that's why I mentioned, the IP issues. I mean, there are a few things I could tell you that if we're not recording, I would say about the European trial for Parkinson's disease, for example, with the IPS there. In terms of there being IP problems with that, and that's been to do with academics licensing out the IP to commercial providers who then have been bought over or acquired by other parties who had no interest in letting the academics continue to use the IP, even if it was originally, I could name names, but I won't while we're recording. So yeah, that is a big problem. I will say that here in the UK, Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, which is an arm's length sort of spin-out agency of the UK government, albeit mainly dedicated to helping commercialize cell therapies, but they did collaborate on a public sector project to produce a clinical grade stem cell line, IPS line, for the UK, which was used in a public sector project, which ultimately wasn't successful, but to develop, I think it was to develop red blood cells from IPS. And that was done in conjunction with the University of Edinburgh, I think, and the National Blood Transfusion Service, and that looked into the possibility of they could get the differentiation to work. It was trying to do it at scale as an alternative blood supply. So yes, most of the existing IPS lines are commercialized, but it's not impossible to create a public sector IPS line if there's the will and if there's seen to be the need to do it. But I don't want to downplay the there is a lot of IP out there, and most of it is owned by private companies, and that is that is a problem. And actually, Di, you mentioned BioGov earlier. There is a paper that Edison, who was one of our postdocs, led on, which is published. I think I probably have shared it with you. It's the patent power paper where we look at the buildup of IP in our 3 case studies. and IPS cells were one of our case studies. So we look at the fact that there's quite a strong commercial sector presence in terms of the top patent holders in the world for gene editing and IPS are both mostly commercially led, with one or two big universities in there. So that's definitely a problem.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd be happy. I mean, if the paper is published, I'm very happy to share it. Yeah.
Yeah, I do recall that paper, and it's really good, but it just needs to go into the library that we're building up. So I mean, that's certainly something that Tess and I really want to get into over the next 6 months. So we might have to have that offline chat with you sometime too, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, there were a few things I couldn't put in the paper because they name names. But just as an aside, something that might be of interest, there is there's I guess a mailing list at the minute, but it's a group, the Global Pharmaceutical Studies and Society Group, GPSS for short, which is run by a couple of people. I think Connor Douglas at Canada. You probably hope you might have come across Connor at some point, Diane. No.
I don't
Um,
think so.
Paul Martin at Sheffield,
Mhm.
and some Sarah Vadman at Vive in Denmark. Although Sarah's not been well, so I'm not sure what she's doing right now. But that group is basically it's looking at alternative routes to manufacture or development or and reuse of pharmaceuticals. It's not necessarily focused on ATMPs and advanced therapies, but there is an advanced therapy subgroup within that. And Connor is also involved in something called SPIN, this social pharmaceutical innovation. I can send you these links. I'm happy to put this stuff in an email, because I know I'm throwing out a lot of acronyms and details there, and I appreciate it's difficult to write down everything. That is involved with that Canadian CAR T cell therapy public sector development, but is also the SPIN project has collaborators in Brazil and Netherlands, Canada, and a few other places who are looking at how to do public sector innovation and whether can they feed in charity provision. What are the ways to do it without needing to partner with big pharma, basically, to try and get medicines to people. They're mainly prioritizing rare diseases, so conditions where it's rare disease, small patient populations, not being targeted by existing companies or developers. So they're not trying to compete with the public sector. They're trying to pick up, or sorry, they're not trying to compete with the private sector. They're trying to pick up the gaps where there's a neglect or an absence of medicine, but a scientific and a clinical possibility to do something using a methodology, whether it's CAR T or a cell therapy or something else. So there are things happening in this development, and there are people in that project who are, I guess, more familiar with the IP. Obviously, I'm not an IP lawyer, so I can only do so much. I can collect evidence from people, but it's usually anecdotal evidence. There are people also sort of looking at that from an IP law perspective, so they may also be useful to talk to.
Indeed, yeah. So this was the sort of thing that was done in agriculture about 10 or so years ago. Did you ever come across there was an organization in the US called PIPRA, Public Intellectual Property Resource in Agriculture, and that was exactly the same thing, was trying to make public sector workarounds of Monsanto's patents, for example, so that you could get public sector development of GM crops and so on. And so, it's interesting. So that sort of model already exists, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't know about that, so I must look that up. That would be really. It's funny because I think, especially within sometimes the sort of sociology of science, you get people who do the medical stuff and you get people who do the agri stuff, and we don't talk to each other enough. So that's a really great suggestion. Thank you.
Yep. Tess, I thought you might have the odd question as well.
Ask a question. Hi, Mike. It's so great to see you. I as you might expect, I want to ask a question about your proposed regulatory model. So I'll ask you to expand. I I'm new to this kind of space in some sense. But in like neurotech and things, I've read quite a lot about this idea of experimental therapies and whether or not we say it this way, a slight lowering of evidential standards to increase the space for experimentation, whether we call it experimentation because we like that language around humans or not. I like how you've coupled that with oversight because, it's sort of like adding a whole layer of, I mean, as you're suggesting it, adding parameters around that while reducing a standard. How did you come to that? Is there other things that you've kind of been reading about or thinking about that relates to that coupling of regulatory strategies?
Yeah, thanks, Tess. So first of all, great to see you. But and thanks for the question. So yes, I mean, one of the things that I didn't actually mean to do, but that ended up happening was I ended up getting asked to review a number of papers on some of the different scandals that have happened. So Jiankui He and his gene-edited babies, but also Paolo Macchier. Oh, I can't say his surname because it's that complicated Italian surname. But the transplant surgeon who, I put his name on my slide so you can see it. But he was basically doing a lot of the trachea transplants, and then a lot of his patients were dying, and it was found out that he was cutting corners and not really following best practice and faking outcomes evidence and just all sorts of dubious things. And so one of the things that really comes across in those accounts of those is how those sort of slightly fraudulent innovators, um you very basically they very often they deliberately blurred the boundaries between research and care. So they avoided research ethics oversight by saying that what they were doing was treating patients, but they avoided oversight from medical ethics committees and hospital oversight committees by saying that what they were doing was research. So basically, obviously, you've got to be careful because you can't. They were flat out lying in some cases, and there is evidence in both, certainly for Jiang Hui He and Paolo, that they actively lied in certain cases, and sought to deceive. But at the same time, they also took advantage of the lack of clarity about what it was they were doing. So one obvious solution to that is to have a much more robust regulatory framework. And I also did some work with Jusaku Minari and Kaio Takashima, and that's a separate paper that again I cited in my talk. We actually really looked at the development of the ASRM. And that was really interesting because obviously Kaio and Jusaku can read Japanese, so they were able to get the minutes of the original committee meetings when that regulation was being drafted, and translated them for me, and we went through them to understand the decision-making process. And the situation in Japan was interesting because when I say historically, Japan's constitution obviously dates from 1948 and it's actually in English because it was largely written by the Americans. But the way that it had been interpreted, the way the post-war constitution had been interpreted, was that it's actually a very vague provision. It's surprising, but it's to do with like autonomy of professions, and doctors had interpreted that provision historically since the 40s to say that they were entitled to make and prescribe their own bespoke treatments and interventions without any government oversight. So clinicians in Japan have always had that right, and they started doing it with cell therapies in the early 2000s, and you got a rash of clinics offering completely unproven therapies with no oversight, and it was legal. So after a patient died in a trial, it was actually it was a slightly strange situation. It was a patient was a client of a Korean company, but they were providing a therapy through a private clinic in Japan, and the patient died in Japan. So this sort of caused a bit of a scandal. The ISSCR was quite unhappy with what was happening in Japan, and I think I've unofficially heard they debated passing a motion of censure, but decided not to. So the Japanese government basically decided something needed to be done. So they were torn between wanting to promote innovation, but also wanting to clamp down a bit on to tighten up their regulation. And so you get the ASRM, which is an attempt to bring in this regulatory framework. I think, and Kaio and Jisaku and I have argued in our paper that it's not stringent enough. But we think that's partly because it's coming from this very low base, which was that if you're a clinician, you can invent whatever therapy you want and no one can say no, and you can offer it for sale, whatever price you see fit, and private patients can pay for it. So coming in from that very low base of almost anything goes, bringing something in was a step up. I think in other public healthcare systems where there's tighter regulation already, you've got a better base to work from because you're not having to curtail the expectation that you can do what you want. It would already be an expectation of regulation. So that's why, and we actually suggested some things in our paper, like, taking account of surgical methods, how you're actually delivering these therapies. Is that innovative? Does that need oversight? Does that need assessment in terms of its risks and benefits? Our argument was yes, it does, as well as just looking at what type of cell that you're using. So that's sort of how that's where these set of ideas are coming from.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So really like practical then.
Yeah. I mean, and also there's been also quite a lot of work in bioethics and, looking at this idea of experimental therapy. I don't know if you know Ignacio Mastroleo. Do again, another difficult to pronounce surname. He's an Argentinian bioethicist. He was a Helix visitor, and his area of expertise was the ethics of experimental intervention. Again, so we had a lot of good discussions with Ignacio, and his whole area was trying to develop frameworks for Argentina to better regulate and oversight from an ethics point of view rather than a legal point of view, but still at that interface of how to design oversight. So that, again, it also kind of came from those conversations that it's, so I can see a couple of things. Yeah.
Now we're coming up to time, and I know it's dinner time for most people, but I just wondered if anybody has just another question that they might like to pose. Dan.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I don't know if it's a brief question, but
that's okay.
The project has been from the start, almost serendipitously thinking about this idea of the public good or the common good as part of the way that we've sort of thought about the groups that we're speaking to, in part because where I'm at the ANU, there's a UNESCO chair for science communication and the public good. And so there's sort of been crossover between those two projects as they've evolved. And your proposal, I think, raises interesting questions about what the public good means and how you see the proposal. I guess, is it a sort of reclamation of the public good? Is it a redefinition of it in this domain? Is it I don't know, something else entirely? Because I did a lot of interviews with Chi here on the call with stem cell researchers, and we talked about commercialization, for example, and many of them were very adamant that you cannot achieve the public good without commercial actors or commercial input in terms of innovation, which is a sort of common narrative. And there were others who were more critical of that sort of arrangement. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how you think the public good fits into the sort of model that you discussed.
Yeah, so I think it is important to say that the model I'm proposing was not to get rid of the private sector. It was to supplement the private sector. So the private sector will, we do have medicines that work. I think I'm not going to try and claim that we don't. So it's not that private sector innovation delivers nothing, but it's that there will be these gaps, and it's there that I think there is a case for public sector work to support the broader public good. So those things where, and it still has to be scientifically and clinically feasible to treat the people. So this is not about, crazy, let's put stem cells into someone's brain to treat autism, but it's about, where there's a CAR T for a subset of cancer that's not particularly served by, Kymria or Yescarta, or where there's another kind of gap where people could be helped, people could benefit from it. And I think, but are not, because it's not. I think where it's not viable, and I see part of the issue as being that because the private sector model is developed at scale, that does put the costs up, and that makes the costs of goods, that increases the cost of goods. And yes, automation and other things may gradually bring that down over time, but I think especially at the minute, it means that you're only going to see the innovation in certain niches, and you're going to see gaps. And it's the same with so-called neglected tropical diseases. It's not that they can't be treated; it's that it's not necessarily a commercially attractive proposition to do so. And so I think my vision of the public good is has to do with equity, I guess, has to do with fair treatment for everyone, that if you can be helped, that you should be helped, especially when so much of the work, so much of the basic research comes through publicly funded institutions. So much of it's done in academic laboratories, in public sector laboratories, that is then spun out. So in one sense, a lot of private sector innovation only happens because governments have set up a pathway to commercialize public sector discoveries, public sector knowledge, public sector work. And actually, what I'm trying to challenge is the idea that that's the necessary pathway, that's the only pathway. So that to me is a policy question. That's a political question. So it's again, a lot of sort of adjacent work on this that's not about stem cells, but that I've read has come around, access to COVID-19 vaccines. And, what we'd have to say is, success of the private sector in getting COVID vaccines to high income countries, and the absolute failure of the private sector to get COVID vaccines to low income countries, to parts of Africa and Latin America and other places. There are places that still barely accessible. You could also look at HIV medicine in Africa. There are these well-documented cases of the private sector failing to help people because it's not its primary interest. And I see the public good as mandating considering everyone's needs, not just the most commercially viable areas. So I don't buy into or believe the idea that markets represent the public interest in any fashion or sense. I think that's simply not the case, and I think that's been proven not to be the case. So I think it's the necessity of supplementing markets.
Thank you.